So I want to try this on today. I want to throw up a word in the air and see how it lands in your head and in your heart. You ready for the word? It's July the 2nd, so here's a good word for July the 2nd. Freedom. I'm going to give you a minute to let that kind of soak in as it comes to your head and it comes into your heart. When you hear the word freedom, what do you think about? Well, it's July the 2nd, right? It's July the 2nd. You ought to be thinking pretty soon about July the 4th. You ought to be thinking about things like fireworks, right? Does anyone's neighborhood like my neighborhood? We began an early celebration last night. My dogs could not be found. They were hiding under beds. I found our dog Dash this morning hiding in a blanket because of the sound of the fireworks. What else do we think about when we think about freedom? We think about cookouts, and we think about apple pie, and we think about ice cream, and it's near lunchtime, and I've just made myself hungry, right? I hope that you will go a little bit deeper when you think about freedom, that you'll think about the flag that waves that reminds us of our country's freedoms, and that you'll think about soldiers who have fought for that freedom and veterans who remember what those battles were like. Freedom. What comes to mind when you hear that word? Freedom. In a couple of weeks, Susie and I will celebrate our 30th year of marriage, and she says, I want to go somewhere. So we're going to go somewhere, have a little bit of a trip, and it'll be a little bit of freedom to be out in the world and to do something fun and different. I wonder what would happen if you were to ask a teenager what she thinks freedom really means. I mean, we all rehearse that speech, right? As long as you live under my roof, you'll follow my rules. It's in that parent handbook, page 55, right? I heard that 1,000 times. For her, maybe freedom is a far country and an inheritance like it was for the prodigal son. Tired of hearing those words. If you live under my roof, you'll follow my rules. Maybe that's what freedom means for a teenager. I heard about a few years ago, lottery was in the millions and millions of dollars in California, and there was a reporter who was given the task of interviewing 5 people with this question. If you win, how would you spend the money? It's a good question, right? The right answer is 10% to the church, right? So 4 of the 5, I'm gonna answer 4 of the 5, and I'm coming back to the 5th one at the end of the sermon, if that's okay. 4 of the 5 said this. Can you guess what they said they'd do if they won the lottery? Quit. You can retire. They said, I would quit my job. And so for 4 out of the 5, for them, freedom meant not having to worry about money anymore, not having to work, but if they chose to work, then maybe they would. We've just come home from annual conference. Greg and Lynette, we missed you there this year. I'm kind of weird. I just going to admit that. If y'all don't already know that, I'm kind of weird. Some things I like. At annual conference, one of the things that I used to like to listen to were retirement speeches. I know that's weird, right? I mean, the retirement speeches. So faithful pastors, some who had served 40 years and some who have served less time of that, would stand on the podium, on the stage, at the altar area, and they would have just a few minutes to thank their families and thank the churches that they served. I thought those were kind of neat, right? I thought those were powerful. George Wayne Martin was a pastor in the annual conference several years ago. He sang his retirement speech. That was really cool. And my friend Gladwin Cannell gave a David Letterman-style top 10 reasons that it's time for him to retire, and I thought that was kind of cool as well. We didn't do that this year. We haven't done that in several years, but I love those speeches. For those pastors, I imagine on their first Sunday after retirement, they felt a little more free to go where they wanted to go and do what they wanted to do. So flags, fireworks, far countries, apple pie, ice cream, cookouts, soldiers, lottery ticket winners. When we hear the word freedom, maybe that's what we think of. But if you were to ask the Apostle Paul what freedom meant to him, he would name none of those things. He would talk about Christian freedom. He would talk about life in the Spirit as opposed to life in the flesh. For Paul, the 10 Commandments, you remember those given to Moses on the mountain? Those 10 Commandments, by the time Jesus came around, by the time he began to teach and preach and he called Paul to be one of his apostles, the 10 Commandments had become 10 million rules that they had to follow. I consider myself a rule follower. Am I the only one? Any rule followers in the choir? So if there's a rule, I'm going to try my best to follow it. Go on beyond that. If there's an expectation that people have of me, I'm going to try to follow that too. I try to live up to that. That's why I love in the church, we talk about grace and forgiveness and starting over and second chances. I love that. Things were different in Galatia. There were problems in Galatia. I alluded to that in the 6th verse of chapter 1 as Paul talks about how they're falling away from the faith so easily, so quickly. In Galatia, Paul came in and he talked about a spiritual circumcision, a spiritual life, and ways to follow Christ, right? On the heels of that, almost in every town that he went to, there was a group of teachers who came in behind him. We call them the Judaizers. And the Judaizer says Paul didn't have it quite right. He says you have to follow the laws of Moses first. You have to be circumcised first, and then you can follow the ways of Christ. And Paul had about all these that he wanted. Imagine being there. Imagine hearing all this. You hear one teacher say one thing and another teacher say another thing. Which is it? It's contrary. Which is it? The argument had gotten so bad, and we alluded to that in the lesson. It says if you bite and devour one another, it says be careful that you don't devour one another. That sounds bad to me. Don't you want to bite and devour one another? I mean, there's trouble in Galatia. And so Paul writes back and says, listen, let me tell you about freedom. For freedom, Christ has set us free. Listen, he says, stand firm and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery. Church, would you say that word with me again? Again, to a yoke of slavery. There are a couple of dangers to Christian freedom that I'd like to lift up to you today. Here's the first. I think it is easier to be enslaved to something than it is to be free of it. Amen? Right? It's a whole lot easier to be enslaved to something, some behavior, some act, than it is to be set free from it. I heard this week about 2 people who had been in prison who went back to prison after they were released. Do you know why? They committed crimes. They went back to jail. You know what they did? One robbed a bank for $1. He stole $1 from a bank. They sent him back to prison. $1. The second stole a pair of shoelaces from a shoe store. That's right. Went back to jail. You know why? They did it on purpose. I mean, you don't steal $1 from a bank, right? He did it because they felt better enslaved in prison than they did free. It's often hard work to get free of something, amen? Hebrews 12 has this line in it. I love Hebrews 12. It says, therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, we'll think about that in November. He says, let us lay aside every weight and the sin that clings so closely or entangles us. Do you know those sins that so easily entangle us and trip us up? Paul lists a few of them. I mean, there's a long list, quite a list, right? He talked about envy and factions and quarrels and drunkenness and carousing and enmities and strife and licentiousness. Wouldn't it be nice not to have to deal with all that stuff, right? I preached 2 of the 3 sermons in this series that we're preaching on questions Jesus asked. And one was, you remember, why are you afraid? And another one 2 weeks ago today, why are you anxious? Wouldn't you like to be free of those things too? Amen? So do not submit again to a yoke of slavery. Do not submit again. When Paul writes that line, he's talking about an old life. He's saying the new life is better. Stand firm, he says. Don't go back to the old life. Listen to what I'm saying to you. The new life is better than the old life. Here's the second danger that we have. And I just want to kind of put it plainly to you. The second danger is that we can't just do what we want to do, because sometimes that will hurt a community. Amen? Does that make sense? People are watching us. Our children are watching us. Our youth are watching us. The world is watching us. How's the Christian church going to behave? I hadn't planned on using this illustration, but I think I will. I'd use it at the 9:45 service, but not at 8:30. My dad was a smoker. He started smoking when he was 16 years old. And every morning I would hear my dad cough. And it woke me up. And I was watching my dad. I was listening to my dad. And I thought to myself, in that example, I'm learning what not to do. I wasn't ever going to smoke because I didn't ever want to cough like that every morning. The world is watching. Amen? Our kids are watching. And so Paul says to us, be careful what you do. It all is summed up in this line where Paul says that of all the rules and all the laws are summed up with this line, you shall love your neighbor as you love yourself. I think I'll put that on the Facebook page for my community neighborhood as fireworks go off tonight. You shall love my neighbor and my dogs as you love yourself. So what do we do with all this on this July the 2nd, 4th of July, just 2 days away? We talked about fireworks and flags and cookouts and soldiers and freedom. Can I ask you, if you were free of everything that had ever encumbered you, ever enslaved you, ever bound you, what would your future, a wide open future, look like? And what would you do with it? I think Paul finishes his 5th chapter with the fruits of the Spirit on purpose. He says to strive after these things, like joy and peace and patience and kindness, gentleness, faithfulness, self-control. You know what Paul says about all those things? Josh, you know what he says? There's no law against those things. No, of course not. He says if you strive for those things, then it's a good thing, right? I told you there were 5 questions of potential lottery winners, right? The 5th guy said this when he was asked by the reporter, if you could do anything, if you won, what would you do with the money? You know what he said? He says, I have 4 kids in college. And he says, if I won the lottery, I would pay off their school loans. He said this. Are you listening, church? Are you listening, choir? He says, I'm bound by love to take care of them. Listen again. I'm bound by love to take care of them. If you're going to be bound by something, let it be things like joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, love, and self-control. There are no laws against these things. Let me close with this word from Jesus. In chapter 8, verse 36 of John's Gospel, we find these words. So if the Son has set you free, you are free indeed. Amen.